Hi, everyone. I'm Priya Natarajan. I am the current director of the Franke program in Science and the Humanities. And I would like to give you a warm welcome to our first talk of the academic year. Our talk today is part of the continuing series on mapping and knowing, in which we've been exploring the role that maps play across a range of disciplines. Mapping here, in the mapping as knowing, is construed more broadly as delineating the boundary between what is known from terra incognita, all that remains to be explored across fields. We've been very fortunate that as part of this series, we've welcomed excellent speakers from within Yale and beyond, experts across disciplinary boundaries who are pushing the frontiers in their work. And today is no different. It is a particular pleasure, however, to introduce one of my favorite faculty colleagues at Yale, Professor Brian Scassellati. He will be speaking to us about his cutting-edge work, mapping the frontier between man and machine. Before telling you a bit more about him and his work, I would first like to thank Mr. and Mrs. Richard and Barbara Franke, whose generous gift has made the Franke program and this event possible. They are usually here sitting in the front row of the audience, but they couldn't make it today. And also, I'm required to give you this notice that this event is being recorded and photographed for educational, archival, and promotional purposes, including use in print or on the internet and in other forms of media. By attending this event today, you agree to the possibility of your voice or likeness captured by these means and used for such purposes without compensation to you, and hereby waive any related right of privacy or publicity. So basically, the paparazzo are on loose. So we have warned you already. Okay, Brian Scassellati is a professor in the departments of computer science, cognitive science, and mechanical engineering at Yale. And he's also the director of the NSF expedition on socially assistive robotics. His research focuses on building embodied computational models of human social behavior and interaction, especially the developmental progression of early social skills. Using computational modeling and interactive robots, his research evaluates models of how infants acquire social skills and assists in the diagnosis and quantification of disorders of social development, such as autism. His other interests include humanoid robots, human-robot interaction, artificial intelligence, machine perception, and social learning. He received his PhD in computer science from MIT. His dissertation work was on the foundations of a theory of mind for a humanoid robot. Really incredibly amazing title, with Rodney Brooks, which used models drawn from developmental psychology to build a primitive system for allowing robots to understand people. So his work has been deeply interdisciplinary from the very start, combining technology in terms of computer science as well as developmental psychology. His work at MIT focused on two very well-known humanoid robots that you might all have heard of, Cog and Kismet. His master's degree, he was basically a lifer at MIT. His bachelor's and master's degrees are also from there. And he has been at Yale since his MIT stint. And his research in social robotics and assistive robotics has been recognized within both the robotics community, the cognitive science community, and the much broader scientific community. He was named, I'll just name a few of his awards. He has a very long list, and I don't want to take away from his own time. He was named an Alfred P. Sloan Fellow in 2007, won the NSF Career Award, and his work has been awarded 5 Best Paper Awards. That is pretty unusual. He was the chairman of the IEEE Autonomous Mental Development and Technical Committee, and program chair for the IEEE International Conference on Development and Learning. In the IEEE, to be asked to chair is one of the biggest honors that you could be asked. So he's done that multiple number of times. And he also chaired the annual meeting of the Cognitive Science Society in 2014. Before I hand over to Brian, I just wanted to mention that our next talk in the mapping series is going to be by the Harvard geneticist David Reich, who's going to be talking about mapping the genome, and that's on Friday, September 27th. So without further ado, Brian, thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming out today. It's wonderful to be here. I proposed this title to Priya, and I became enraptured with the title, and it was only about an hour after that I realized I had no idea what the answer to this was going to be. So I hope you're going to join me today in just thinking about some of these really interesting issues. about how it is that we differentiate between man and machine. Now, the first argument I want to put forward is that really this isn't about appearance, and it isn't in fact about reality either. That is, we're at the point now where we're going to be seeing machines that even if they aren't compelling to us today, that in the near future they very may well be. We see robots that are modeled as androids, like this system called Geminoid from Hiroshi Ishiguro, that maybe at first glance looks good enough to pass, or at least a brief inspection, but pretty quickly you can spot a few inconsistencies in it. You can say, oh, the eyes aren't quite right, or the way the lips curl, or the way the wrinkles in the skin, maybe they aren't quite it. And it's true that that may be the case. But we can imagine a foreseeable future where we have systems that are so lifelike that they are just like a person. In fact, one of my favorite examples of this comes from a group in Europe called Electric Circus. And they have a robot named Dirk that they routinely put out in public in various cities. And it usually takes about an hour or two before people notice that it's a robot. And that's in part because it's dressed, like a homeless person. And Dirk, with its shopping cart, wanders around the streets, and people, for the most part, just avoid it and walk past, unaware that it's a machine. So maybe it's at least easy for us to believe at this point that under the right circumstances or in the near future, we will have something that will look enough like a person that you'll, at least for a moment, be fooled. So if that's not the interesting boundary, then what is? Because we very much, as humans, differentiate between machines and people. We, in fact, like to draw a very firm line between those things that we treat as objects, even though they might do very intelligent things, that they might be very reasonable in the way that they respond to the world, that they might in fact even have memory and learn and adapt as they continue their existence. And there are other things that, while they're still made of the same mechanical parts, or in fact imaginary parts, we're very happy to treat as if they are people. And fundamentally, we respond to these differently. We believe that Wall-E is sad. We cry when his memory is erased. We have a feeling that these robots are watching us and that they have thoughts and ideas, desires. But we don't think about the Voyager spacecraft in that way. So why is it that we have this clear division? Why is it that we can draw this very clean line between the two? Well, maybe it is just those mechanical parts. Maybe it's the fact that the things over here on the right-hand side look more like people than those things over there on the left-hand side. Maybe it's just those anthropomorphic characteristics, the presence of eyes or a face. But I don't think that that's it either. Everyone's seen the little vacuuming robots like iRobot's Roomba. And I think we would all be very happy initially to put those over on the object side of this line. They don't have eyes, they don't have a face, they don't act like people at all. They just scurry around on the carpet. And yet, when iRobot introduced these devices, this was the first commercial robotic system that was being sold as a consumer electronic device. And they were worried about people being willing to buy this relatively high-priced vacuum. So they put in place the most sort of consumer-friendly return policy they could. They said, if anything happens to your Roomba, you just call us, let us know, we'll send you a new one right away. And when you get the new one, put the old one in the box and send it back to us. And their customers hated this policy. Their customers refused to do this. They called and they complained bitterly to the company to the point that iRobot had to change their policy because people didn't want some strange robot coming into their home. They wanted their robot back. Fix my robot and send it back, they said. Now, some of them took this even farther and they dressed up their Roombas. They made costumes for them. They named them. And in fact, the way we treat these little things that run around on the floor is often more like a person. How many of you have had a car that had a name? How many of you think that your laptop is sometimes out to get you? How many of you believe your cell phone not only dramatically but deliberately drops your calls sometimes? We think about technology in many, many ways like it's human. Now, I'm not the first one to notice this by any means. And in fact, I think the two people who made this argument in the most concise and interesting way were Cliff Nass and Byron Reeves. And Nass and Reeves wrote this book called The Media Equation. And they're going to be our starting point for talking about this frontier. Because their observation was this. They said, look, people evolved in a world in which there wasn't this advanced technology. There were objects, things like rocks, trees, and there were agents, things like people and dogs. And we were very clear in differentiating. Rocks don't think, dogs do. Trees aren't sad, humans are. We made this division, but when it came to dealing with technology, we were faced with a dilemma because we had no way of combining those two ideas. We had no intermediary category that had half a thought or part of a feeling. And so Reeves and Nass said, when we were forced to deal with these advanced forms of technology, we treated them like other agents. We treated them like people or pets. Now, to prove this, Reeves and Nass went and they took a few dozen experiments out of psychology and social psychology, and they replicated them with technology. That is, they take an experiment designed like this. Let's say the guy in the beard walks in and he does some service for you. And then he asks, how did I do? You're very likely to tell him, good job, you did great. But if the guy in the beard comes in and he does the same exact thing for you, but then he leaves and someone else walks in and says, how did the guy in the beard do? You're more likely to give him a negative rating. You're more critical, or maybe more honest. The same pattern holds when we deal with technology. And what Reeves and Nass did is they said, let's replace the guy in the beard and the woman in blue with two computers. We'll have one computer, we'll call it the blue computer. Whoops, my slides keep jumping. The blue computer will come in and give you some service. And if it asks you, how did I do? You're more likely to say, good job, blue computer. You did great. But if for some reason the blue computer gives you the exact same service, and then we wheel it out of the room and we wheel in a red computer and the red computer says, how'd that blue computer do? You're like, well, let me tell you, here are all the problems with it. That's not to say that we rate the computer as doing as good a job as the human. That's not to say the scores are identical, but the same pattern holds. And Reeves and Nass did this not with one experiment, not with two experiments, but with about 36 studies, all looking at replacing this human-human pairing with a machine. And in every time they did this, they came up with the same result. The same pattern that holds with humans holds with every other kind of technology that they used. And so we call this the media equation. And here's the one and only piece of math that I will show today. Ready? Here it is. It says the way we respond to humans and the way we respond to robots and the way we respond to virtual agents and the way we respond to any other technology is basically the same. That has been our guiding principle in looking at this boundary for almost 25 years. Let me show you a couple of examples of that and some embarrassing photos of me along the way. So Priya mentioned one of the robots I used when I was in graduate school. There's me in graduate school with a robot named Cog. And Cog was a big 600-pound hulk of a robot. And my job was to sit in front of the robot and build a visual system for this robot. And sometimes the robot, even though its head was, well, not very human-like, it had cameras, but it had 4 cameras, not 2 eyes. But sometimes that robot, while I was working, would turn and it would look right at me. And whenever it did this, I would stop what I was doing and look up at the robot. Now, I had written the code that made the robot do this, and after a few seconds of looking at me, it would get bored and it would go look somewhere else. And 22 seconds later, it would come back and look at me, and I would turn and look at the robot. My thesis was written in 22-second increments because while I tried for months to train myself not to look at this thing, every time it turned to look to me, every time its eyes went away, I'd go back to working, and then suddenly it would look at me and I'd stop what I was doing. In the same way that if a person had been there and they turned to look at me, I would have done the same thing. The pattern held the same. Now, sometimes that pattern's a little harder to get and look at. Let me show you another example of that, a more recent one. In the 1950s, Solomon Asch did a series of experiments about conformity in humans. And he said, let's see what will happen if I give people a very obvious and simple problem, but I have a bunch of other people, Confederates, who give the wrong answer right before I ask them. And so he would tell them, look over there at Exhibit 1, there's a line. I want you to tell me which of these other 3 lines is the same length. And for the first couple of trials, his 3 Confederates would say, A, A, A. And the real participant would say, A. But then, on the real trial, the Confederates would pick a different, incorrect answer. And he would ask, which one of these is the most similar? And the Confederates would all say, C, C, C. And then they would turn to you and say, what's the answer? And you knew the right answer was A. But in fact, about a third of the people would suddenly say, C. And they'd go along with the herd. And this is a wonderful experiment that's been replicated many times over. Now, if you try to do this with a group of robots, in fact, it doesn't work. If you have 3 robots up there saying C, 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 people say, those are some broken machines. The answer's A. They don't go along with the herd. But that's because they believe that the robots might be wrong. The same sort of thing happens if I give you 3 children ahead of you, and the kids all say, C, 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 and you say, the answer's A, what are you? And then all of a sudden, you find an example of this, and you have to just make things a little bit more challenging. So a few years ago, one of my graduate students, Nicole Salamons, found a way to study this. And it was based on a card game named Dixit. Anybody ever play this game? Okay, great. So in the game, there's a bunch of very abstract cards. And the person who's it for this turn will pick a word and try to describe one of these cards to you. And so if I say, I don't know, delicious, you would have to pick which one of these cards do I mean. Now maybe I'm thinking about the apple in the upper left-hand corner. Or maybe I've picked up on something else. But you'd have to try to find that match. Nicole did the same thing, but with a group of robots. She gave everybody a tablet. 3 robots, you as a human, and another robot. And the robot on the screen in front of you said a word like lonely. And then you were shown 6 cards. And you indicated which of the cards you thought the robot was referring to. But then what she did is she said, let's reveal everyone's answers and give them a chance to change their answer. So she would tell them the 2 most popular selected items. And she would either show you how many people had chosen each of them, or she would show you just what the top 2 were. Now, we rigged the experiment so that no matter which one of these top 2 the human picked, all of the robots voted for the other one. So in fact, you had to change your preference in order to go along with the robots. But when we asked people to do this, when they saw all of the robots going against them, again, about 1/3 of them changed their answer. They said, well, it must not be C, or it must not be A, it must be C. Maybe all those robots are right. So sometimes it takes us a little bit more to dig and find that pattern, but for the most part, we still find that same pattern, that media equation. Humans, the way we interact with people, the way we interact with robots, the way we interact with virtual agents, it's all the same. Now, if we want to explore this frontier, though, the most interesting parts are going to be the places where this equation breaks. Those are the little notches in the boundary where something is somehow different. So for the rest of today, I want to try to show you some of those unique places where things are different. Now, that's not to say that do we treat robots differently than we treat humans? Yes, of course we do. But where the patterns change, that's where things get really interesting. Okay, so let's consider just this first part. When is it that we treat people and robots differently? Let's forget about other forms of technology. Let's just deal with these 2. Let me introduce at first a little robot named Keepon that you saw the caricature of before. And here's what the robot looks like in real life. It's only about 3-4 inches tall. And it's moderately expressive. You can tell what direction it's looking. It can sort of bounce up and down to express itself a little bit, but not much more. It's minimally anthropomorphic. We brought this robot into classrooms here in New Haven. There was a wonderful magnet school here in New Haven where about 90% of the kids speak Spanish or Portuguese at home, and they're struggling to learn English in the public school system. And we went and we talked to classroom teachers, not the administrators, the actual K-2 teachers. And we said to them, what's the biggest problem that you have? And every one of these teachers said the same thing to us. Anybody want to guess what it was? What do you think these teachers said was difficult? Attention span. No, they're kindergarten teachers. They're used to dealing with kids with no attention span. What do you think it was? Limited number of students per teacher, not enough time to go one-on-one. That's a lot of it. But you know what? They said, even if we didn't have that, even with just the resources we have, we could be doing better, except for one thing. And it's exactly what's happening right now. The teacher would ask a question, and no one speaks up. And so they would pick on people. They would ask a really easy question, and they would ask one of the students, and the students would deflect. They'd avoid answering. Because they were afraid. They were embarrassed. They didn't want to say the wrong thing in front of the teacher and in front of their classmates. They were worried that they would say it in the wrong way in this language that they were just learning. And so the teachers said to us, they said, our number one problem is we have no idea what our kids know and what they don't know. And we said, well, what would happen if you had one-on-one time? What would happen if you could sit down one-on-one? Would that solve this problem? And they said, for the most part, no, because the kids still don't want to tell us the wrong answer. So we brought in robots like this, and we sat them down, and these kids suddenly were willing to make mistakes in front of the robot. Here's a child who's being asked to translate the Spanish verb hacer into English. Now, hacer in English either becomes make or do, depending on about 14 different context rules. You make your bed, you don't do your bed. You do your homework, you don't make your homework. And learning those requires learning those context rules. You're going to see him make a mistake. The robot's going to ask him in Spanish to translate something into English, and he's going to make a mistake.
Necesito mi gorro extra. Por favor, también dile que haga espacio para mi gorro en inglés.
You can do a space more.
Bueno, estamos listos para irnos. Deberíamos de hacer un baile para celebrar todo nuestro trabajo duro. Dilas po en inglés que...
So instead of make more space, he says, do a space more. He gets it wrong. And in fact, the robot recognizes this. It recognizes which of those 14 context rules he has trouble with. And it can give him more help on that one in particular. And so when kids sit down with these robots, we get kids who in 5 15-minute sessions with the robot go from 30 percentile on standardized tests to 80 percentile on standardized tests on that material. All because we can target what exactly they need help with. We can't do this with the same amount of classroom instruction. We can't do this with the same amount of one-on-one instruction from a teacher. Because here's the pattern is different. With adults, with other kids, they're too embarrassed to make these mistakes. But they're okay making these mistakes with the robot. Let me show you another example of how robots are different from people. This is a robot that we use in clinical practice here at the Child Study Center in Yale New Haven Hospital. And it's a robot called Ellie. And we work with kids with autism, kids who have difficulty with social skills. And one of the things that's really difficult when you do therapy is giving those clients a sense that they have mastered the material. Because so much of their therapy is basically repetition over and over and over again of, nope, that was wrong, do it again. Nope, that was wrong, do it again. So we bring in Ellie, and we've programmed Ellie to make mistakes. In fact, to make the same mistakes that these kids had practiced on. Ellie interrupts them while they're talking. Ellie looks away from them when it's talking to them. Ellie introduces off-topic conversations. And we ask the kids to become teachers and to help teach Ellie. And when we do that, they're thoroughly happy to do so. Much more so than when we do this with a human adult. So you're going to see the same child on the top and the bottom. But on the top, we've told him that Laura, the very nice blonde woman on the left-hand side, who he's never met, needs this help, and he's supposed to teach her. And on the bottom, we've told him the robot, Ellie, needs that help. And when he comes into the clinic for the first time and he sits with these two, he's thoroughly excited to help Ellie. And right away, he gets started. And when he does this with Laura on the top, he has no interest in engaging with her. And in fact, he mostly just stares in the mirror. He doesn't believe that Laura really needs help like this. He doesn't believe that that's a role that she can take on. But he believes it of the robot. Because we don't have predefined ideas about what the robot is supposed to be. And so if I tell you this robot needs help, well, of course it needs help. If I tell you it has the same problems that you used to, well, okay, I could believe that. The robots work in these situations because they can take on these roles that we can't easily put adults in. This is one of our best therapies, and actually, because the kids walk away from this feeling great. They feel like they actually are masters of the material. So when we look at these two, humans and robots, there are a few things that break our pattern. The robots are social, and they're social enough that we look at them in the eye and we respond to them, but they're not too social. They don't trigger embarrassment. They don't make us self-conscious. And we don't have predefined roles for them. We're willing to believe whatever we're told with them. Okay, how about the other side of this equation? Maybe people are different from robots, but then maybe all of the different types of technology, maybe they're all the same. Maybe we respond to them in the same ways. I could believe that if I have a different way of treating technology, then maybe I treat all of the technologies with this same strange pattern. Let me show you a couple of, again, things that break this rule. These are both wonderful experiments that were both proposed by Yale undergraduates. So I get to say that as a special mark of distinction for them. The first one was an experiment that was designed by Wilma Bainbridge when she was a sophomore. And when she was a sophomore, she came in and I had her in class and she said to me, I have this great idea, but I need some things in order to do this experiment. And I said, okay, what do you need? Tell me about it, what do you need? You know, figuring she's gonna tell me a certain amount of money to pay participants or maybe some equipment. And she got right to the point, she said, no, I need your office. And by the time she'd finished explaining to me, I said, this sounds great. And I turned over my office to Wilma for 3 months. I hid out in the library and in my lab for 3 months. And while I was gone and hiding away, Wilma went to all of her friends and she said, look, I'm the lab manager for this professor and he's on sabbatical. He's given me all of this work to do and I don't have time for it, but he told me I could hire people. Would you come do an hour worth of, clerical tasks? I'll pay you $30. And she got about 100 undergraduates to say yes. And so she brought them all into my office, what was clearly a faculty office on campus. And when they walked in the room, half of them walked in and sat down next to this little 2.5-foot tall robot. The other half of them walked in and sat down next to a flat screen showing a two-way video conference with the same robot. Now, whether they sat next to the real robot or the robot on the screen, both robots did the same things. The robots would wave to them when they walked into the room, would follow them and watch them as they walked around the room, would occasionally try to make a silly gesture to them, and mostly acted bored. And while they were there getting used to the robots, we gave them some office tasks, file some documents, proofread this, alphabetize these exams. And then Wilma sent them an instant message and said, we got one last job for you to do before the end of the hour. There's some books that are all over the place in the professor's office. We need them put away. The robot knows where the books belong. And suddenly the robot, who'd been completely distracted, paid attention and started pointing to piles of books. And everybody did what the robot asked. They went over and they picked up the books, and then the robot would point to a location on the shelf and they'd go and they'd put the books on the shelf. 3-4 times they put books away. And then finally, The robot points to this nice new pile of textbooks on the corner of my desk. $500-600 worth of textbooks. And then it points to the trash can. And the question was, how many Yale undergraduates sitting in what was clearly a faculty office would throw away $600 worth of brand new textbooks because the robot said so? Anyone want to guess? How many of you would have thrown the books away? I would have thrown them away, yeah. Right? We all like to think, oh, maybe one or two of us would do it. In fact, when it was the real robot, when people sat next to the real robot, 2/3 of them picked up the books, threw them in the trash can, turned around for their next job with no hesitation whatsoever. No questioning, no nothing. Just pick up the books, throw them in the trash, get on. What's next? I want my $30. When it was the robot on the screen, only about 17% of them threw them away. They all picked up the books. They all walked over to the trash can. They were clear on what the robot wanted. Most of them tried to negotiate with the robot. Are you sure you want? They would mime throwing the books away to see if they could get the robot to respond. They eventually usually hid the books on a shelf near the trash can or behind the trash can. One genius undergraduate put the books on the floor, put the trash can on top of the books. Anything to avoid throwing them away. Now, we thought maybe this was an effect that they just really didn't understand, and maybe the flat screen, they were losing something. So we ran a third condition of this, where not only did you see the robot on the flat screen, but there was another monitor next to it. And on the monitor next to it, there was a picture of the trash can and an arrow going into the trash can. Still, less than 20% of them threw it away. But when it was the real robot there, 2/3 of them did it without a second thought. We asked them afterwards. They didn't even think what they did was unusual. The robot said so. Of course I should do it. Not a second thought. Why are those two technologies different? Well, in fact, we know these answers, that when we have a physical presence, that changes the way we respond. We knew this about ourselves long before we knew this about robots. You know why we had door-to-door salesmen? Because when you've got someone there standing at your door, it's really hard to say no to them. You go to business school. You're taught in business school. You've got a big deal. You want to close the big deal. You don't email. You don't Skype. You don't write. You go there in person to get the big deal signed. Because people are more likely to do what you want when you're there. Same's true with robots, but not with things on a screen. When the real robot says to you, throw those books away, you go, yep, throw those books away. In psychology, we call this compliance. So robots and other technology might not be the same. Let me give you one more reason to believe that. We had a group of undergraduates who wanted to do this, but with a really cognitive puzzle. Any of you ever seen these puzzles before? Anybody know what they are? Maybe a few? Okay. These are called nonograms or pick across. How many of you have ever played Sudoku? Okay. It's similar to Sudoku. It's kind of a little logic puzzle. And the way the puzzle works is you start with a blank puzzle, and at the end, you finish the puzzle by shading in some of the squares, but not all of them. And which squares you shade in are determined by the numbers on the rows and the columns. So if you look at that bottom row, it has the numbers 6 and then 1. That means on that row, you've got to have 6 squares together that are contiguous, shaded in, and then some number of blank squares, and then 1 shaded in square. And you could have blanks before it or blanks after it, but it's got to look like 6 and then 1. Now, on that bottom row, there's only 8 squares across. There's only one way for you to do that. But if you look at the row above it, it says 7. You don't know whether it's the first 7 or the last 7 that you're supposed to shade in. And you won't know that for sure until you start looking at the constraints on the columns. Because not only do you have to get all the rows right, you have to get all the columns right as well. In computer science, we call this a constraint satisfaction problem. It's NP hard. It's kind of the hardest kind of puzzles we like to deal with computationally. For those of you who aren't computer scientists, think of it this way. A 10 by 10 puzzle like this would take you about 15 minutes to solve. They're pretty tricky. Now, that's not to say that I couldn't help you out a little bit. Because even though you now know all the rules to do this, I could give you some hints. For example, I could teach you this hint. I could say, look, in that row of 7, if I don't know whether it's the first 7 or the last 7, there's still something that I know right away. What can I say for sure? The middle 6, right? The middle 6 have to be shaded in. So as soon as I see that 7, I could go and do that. Okay. We came up with a set of about 20 hints or lessons like these. And then we brought in a few hundred undergraduates, and we sat them down, and we broke them into 4 groups. One group got taught the rules just like you did, and then left on their own as a control group. Just how well can you do without any help? The second and the third group got the same hints, but either delivered from just the speakers of a laptop or from a little video of that keep-on robot. And the last group got the same recorded hints, but they got a real physical robot sitting next to them. Now, we played one last dirty trick on them, which is we had them solve 3 puzzles, but the first and the last puzzle were actually the same, just rotated by 90 degrees. That meant they were just exactly as hard, but no one ever recognized them as the same puzzle. And so we could compare how fast they solve it the first time and how fast they solve it the second time. Now, if you were in that first group who got no help whatsoever, just got taught the rules, you improve your performance by about 2 minutes. You go from 15 minutes to 13 minutes solving time. Just practice makes you better. If you got some of those hints, either from that disembodied laptop voice or from the video of the robot, you improve by about 3.5, 4 minutes. Those hints were useful. But if you got the same hints, but delivered from the robot, you improve by about 6 minutes or more. There's no good reason for this. You're not getting any extra help. It's not like the presence of that nice little yellow robot suddenly makes you smarter. It's not giving you any more information than what you had from the video. But in fact, you learn better when there's someone there in person. This says, go to class. Just show up for lecture. You will learn more than watching the video later online. And in fact, if you don't believe these 2 studies that were run here by undergraduates, you should realize that each of them have been replicated about 40 times. And there was a review in Science last summer. And in all of those different studies, the same size effect basically occurs. People are more compliant with that physical robot, and they learn more from that physical system. Okay. There's one more part to this equation that we want to look at. Maybe it's just that robots are special. Now, I'm a roboticist. I just want to believe that from the start. Maybe it's that robots, oops, again, I'm jumping ahead too quickly. Maybe robots just are different. They're in some ways like people, in some ways like technology. Maybe there's some things that are just unique about them. All right, let me pose you a challenge. When I was in grad school, I had another robot, and this robot called Kismet. And this thing, which was only about 1 foot high, had these different facial expressions. It had some anthropomorphic characteristics. It had eyes and a mouth and lips. And it also had these kind of dog-like ears. And it could make this wide variety of expressions, some of which were more or less friendly. All right. So let's go back to kind of a friendly version of the robot here. Let's pause it right there. Because when this robot was operating in the lab, most of the time it was a pretty happy robot. And we brought in, my advisor loved bringing in school groups for tours, and we brought in probably about 1,000 kids to see this robot. And they all saw the robot, and they all ran over to it, and the robot would babble randomly to them. And they were excited. They'd go over and they'd see what the robot did. They'd try testing out different things. They'd play with the robot to see what it could do. But all of them were happy to engage with it, except for one group. At one summer, we had a group of about 20 foreign students, a group of about 13 to 14-year-old girls from Japan who had come to Boston and came to tour the lab. And we brought them in to see this robot, and the robot smiled at them, and it wiggled its ears, and it babbled at them. And every single one of those girls backed up against the far wall. And they wanted nothing to do with this robot. We thought maybe that this was about, permission and about being, permitted to go, and we said to them, no, you can come up close, and we demonstrated to them, and we tried to bring them up close, and none of them wanted to. They were scared of this robot. And it took us a long time to figure out, but in fact, this robot is missing one very important thing in its face that made them feel this way. What was that thing? What's the robot missing? A nose. Nope, that's not it. Teeth. Nope, that's not it. Keep them coming. Hair. That's not it. A face itself. Nope, they're perfectly happy without that. What else? Chin. Nope. Tongue. Nope. It's missing all these pieces, true. But this was not it. Eyelashes. No, it has eyelashes. A voice. Nope. It had a voice. It was talking to them. Hair. Nope. They're perfectly happy with bald robots. What is it? Skin. Nope. Skinless robots. Forehead. Nope. Body. Nope. Head-only robots they were perfectly happy with. What's that? Eyebrows. No, it has these weird little brownish eyebrows up there. Yeah, they're kind of floating up in midair too. They were perfectly happy with that. Nope. I'm going to give you the answer. But the more interesting thing is why. The thing that this robot is missing is a lower eyelid. It has an upper eyelid, but no lower eyelid. Now, why is that important? None of us would have guessed. I would have guessed nose. That would have been my first guess. Why is that lower eyelid the thing that was making them think this robot was so angry and scary? Now, I grew up in New Jersey. To me, when this robot smiled like this and babbled at me like an infant, I thought it was friendly. I thought it was happy. But culturally, these girls were raised in Japan, in a culture where facial expression is important, but not as prevalent as things like postural expression. They saw this robot that didn't have a body at all, but they thought this robot was angry because you could always see the white underneath the pupil. And the only time you do that with humans is when they're leaning forward and looking up, and their eyes are rolled up, and you can see that white all under the pupil. And so even though this robot doesn't have a body, they felt like this robot was aggressive and angry, and they wanted nothing to do with it because it was missing the lower eyelid. One of the things that robots do is they make us pay attention to details that we would otherwise miss completely. We've looked, and in all the history of animation that I can find, in all of the psychology about facial expression, nowhere can I find a rule that says lower eyelids are important for this reason in these cultures. But we discover that with these systems. Sometimes we uncover these little things where the details really do matter. And for these children, it was dramatic. It was the difference between this is a cute, fun partner and this thing was out to get me. So robots are a little bit unique in that they do force us to pay attention to those details. But more than that, sometimes we can use these tools to help define that frontier even more. I started out by drawing this line between the things that we treated like objects and the things that we treated like agents. And in fact, for the psychologists among you, that's no news. You would probably point me at this point back to the 1944 studies of Heider and Simmel and say, look, we've known for many, many years that you can take things that are just shapes on a screen and make those shapes move and tell a story with them. And that when people watch that story and describe it later, they won't describe it in terms of positions and orientations of those shapes. They'll define it in terms of relationships and feelings. They'll tell you who's frustrated at the end. They'll tell you which two shapes were friends and who was a bully. When in fact, they were shapes on a screen. They didn't have thoughts or feelings or desires or friendships. But we do that naturally. In fact, we train people to do that. We call it animation. We train people to give life to these creatures. And in fact, most of what we know in the way that this happens, even within robotics, is that we follow these rules that have been outlined in art and animation and in psychology and psychophysics that are all based around the way things move. But one of the wonderful things you find out with robots is that sometimes there are other factors at play. So let me show you again another study designed by Yale undergraduates that again has been replicated by at least 50 groups worldwide, that even 10 years after its first appearance is still being refined. And this was a really simple little study that involved a robot that cheated. So here was this 2.5 foot tall robot before that you saw telling people to throw away books in the trash can. And this time we brought people in and we said, you're gonna sit and you're gonna play rock, paper, scissors with this robot. And so they sat and they played 20 minutes of rock, paper, scissors. 20 minutes of rock, paper, scissors, in case you do not have a toddler, is about the most mind-numbing thing that you can imagine. 20 minutes and we had undergraduates clawing their eyes out, ready to get out of the room.
Yes, I win. We have tied this round. Yes, I win. Oh, you win. We have tied this round.
And even though this robot was moving and seemingly making decisions about what gesture to throw and talking to them and telling them, I win, you win, we tied, and seemingly seeing what they were doing and responding, by 20 minutes in, this thing was not an agent, it was an object. In the words of one of our undergraduates, it was a boring toaster. Now, for half of those who came in and did this, after 20 minutes, we had one unusual thing happen, which is the robot would throw a gesture, the person would throw a gesture, the robot would lose, but it would incorrectly say, I win. And when that happened, people were surprised.
I'm not so sure about that.
What?
We tied.
How?
I don't think so.
They thought it was unusual. They thought something interesting had happened. They often said something. But then the robot went back to its normal operation. And they figured it was a glitch. It was a malfunction. It was still just an object. We made them play 20 more minutes of rock, paper, scissors. We paid them not nearly enough money for this. And by the end, this group came out after 40 minutes of rock, paper, scissors, and they said, hand me the cash, I'm out of here. We said, did anything unusual happen? They said, cash first. They were done. The other half played 20 boring minutes, and then one unusual thing happened. The robot threw a gesture, and they threw a gesture, and even though they had won, the robot slowly changed its hand position and then said, I win. And now their response was completely different.
Yes, I win. Sneaky bastard. Yes, I win.
That's cheating.
Yes, I win.
You're tricky.
Yes, I win.
And they thought that this was funny. They thought this was interesting. Some of them got upset about this. But then in the second 20 minutes they sat there, they kept talking to the robot. None of them had talked to the robot in the first 20 minutes. One of them kept on this 20-minute dialogue of, oh, you better not cheat this time. I'm watching you. I'm still watching you. I remember. I'm not letting you cheat again. 20 minutes later, they walked back in. We walked them out of the room, and they didn't care about the payment. They said, did you know that robot cheats? They wanted to make sure that somebody in charge knew that this was happening, because that's not supposed to be the way it goes. 20 minutes later, they were still believing that this thing was an agent. It was still out to get them. They made eye contact with it. They thought it was more intelligent than the others. They thought it was more interesting to play with. It had better strategies. It was better looking than the other robot. I still don't understand that one. But everything for them changed. And what was really hard is that it didn't stop. All of our other motion-based techniques for generating agency and animacy, they're the kinds of things we can turn on and turn off so easily. This one wasn't. It was very hard for us to get them to stop. What's even more interesting is that this is very specific to it stealing your victory. If in fact the robot cheats, but cheats in your favor, if it gives you a victory you don't deserve, you could care less. It's not an agent. That was just a malfunction. You're just lucky. In fact, here's a different robot doing that same thing. When the robot cheats in order to lose, throws you a victory,
Let's play.
we get confusion, we get uncertainty.
Oh, you win. Let's play. Oh, you win. Let's play.
But when that robot steals your victory,
Yes, I win. Let's
You
play.
can't do that.
you are not ready to put up with that.
Yes, I win.
You cheated. You cheated now.
Yes, I win.
Hey, big
Let's
cheater.
play.
You cheat, super cheat.
I have so many hours of Yale undergraduates swearing at robots, you would not believe it. So let me say this just at the end. One of the things that's really unique about these is that robots let us investigate things about that frontier, about that boundary, that we couldn't investigate with people. It's hard for me to produce for you a person with no lower eyelid. It's hard for me to produce a person that you're willing to sit and play this game against where you're uncertain what their agency status is. But we can do that with the robot, and we can uncover things. Now, as a very last thing, I can ask the question, why is it important? Why do I need to know what that boundary is like? Why should I care about that? Well, one of the real interesting things is that no matter what we end up doing, those unique parts of the boundary are often where we find the most interesting and exciting applications for these robots. I told you before that you are more compliant with a physical robot than other technology. You learn faster with a physical robot. That's one of the reasons we use robots for tutoring now. In fact, last year we started doing in-home tutoring for kids with autism with a little robot platform. And the kids would sit and play social skills games with these robots. They would play the same kinds of games that they would in therapy, and they did them in the really complex and difficult environment of the home. And I don't have a ton of time to talk about it, so I'm going to skip past and just say, let's let one of the parents who've done this actually say something about it.
He is so excited to spend his half an hour helping the robot find his way home, and he will come on and I will set it up for him, turn on the robot, and he is engaged immediately. Having the ability to have this robot and to do a half an hour therapy with him that was really specific to what he needs to focus on was just, it seemed like a great opportunity for him, and it's really been just, he's been engaged and intrigued, and sometimes the therapies are, they get a little exhausting and he's not excited, and this one wasn't like that. He was ready to play at 7:30 in the morning. That we went to the playground one day, and I noticed immediately there was a group of children playing in the sand, and he walked up to them and said, "Hi, what are you doing?" And I don't think he would have done that a month ago.
This family in particular, even though with all of our families we saw kids make clinically verified skill improvements, first time a piece of technology has done that, where we saw kids not only trying to avoid their therapy or skate by, but actively engaging with it. We saw the parents being thrilled with it. We saw the skills start to bleed over to the playground. This family, they found out midway through that month that they had the robot, the husband got a new job, got transferred to the West Coast. They were supposed to move right away. They shipped all of their stuff out of their house, and that's why all those shelves are bare. And they decided that for the last 3 weeks, they were going to sleep in sleeping bags on the floor so they could stay with the robot because of how much that was meaning to their son. That's what we get when we start to characterize this boundary. We get systems where we really can make an impact on people. All right, let me end just by saying thanks to a whole lot of people. If you want any other information, our website's there, and I'm happy to take questions until you're tired of us. So, thank you. Yeah. Oh, wait, they want you on.
So my observation is I'm a lot less patient with my virtual assistants than I am with real people.
Yes. It's interesting because one of the things that we see with real physical robots is that people are much more willing to adjust when the robots make mistakes. And I don't know if that's an embodiment effect that carries over or not. But we see it all the time. We build systems that do manufacturing with people. So side by side, you're building a birdhouse with the robot. And in fact, when the robot makes a mistake and drops a tool, they don't get mad at the robot, they help it out. And we see that happen over and over again. Yeah.
Thanks very much for an interesting talk. So in the very last work with the autistic child,
yeah.
It's unethical, but I'll ask anyway. Was there a controlled experiment where the robot was on a screen instead of in person?
Yeah, we don't do a control there because we know, in fact, that these kids will not learn from things on the screen. We've had a couple of other studies that predate that show it. What we do use as a control, though, is we track the children the month before they get the robot, then a month with the robot, and then a month after the robot has gone away. And in fact, those kids, actually I can just show you the data, that's the easiest thing. Those kids in the month before the robot shows up, they show no difference in the social skills that we measure. A month with the robot and they start showing improvement. But you take the robot away and that improvement starts to fade away. Now that's not, in fact, unusual, and that's in fact what we expect to see. Because a month with a personal therapist sitting in your home 100% of the time, you don't get lasting effects after just a month. So if we had gotten that with the robot, something would have been wrong. So we know that that's actually sort of exactly the pattern that we wanted to see. Sure.
In the case of the robot making facial expressions that frightened away some of the students,
yeah,
did those students recognize immediately that the reason they were frightened was because it was missing a lower eyelid?
No, so they couldn't tell us that, and that was really what was in part really interesting. They could tell us what they thought. They thought the robot was aggressive. They thought the robot was angry, okay? But they couldn't pinpoint exactly why that was. That took a little bit of experiment on our part in order to figure that out, and it actually took us a couple of months, so don't feel bad that you missed the eyelid. You know, we put that thing together, and it still took us months to figure it out.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I wonder if there are studies about interactions between children and toys, and whether toys are kind of an intermediate agent between humans and robots.
Yeah, and you have to now talk about different ages of children as well. And in fact, one of the really interesting things that you see is you see young kids who are willing to take, let's say, you know, a stuffed doll and to have a pretend relationship with that doll, to have or for them what is probably a real relationship, but with this character that does not reciprocate in any way. And you introduce a thing with technology that does have that kind of interactivity, and that relationship becomes even stronger. We've seen these kinds of things with robots being developed for kindergarten. We've even done experiments with robots with kids as young as 6-month-old deaf infants learning sign language from robots. So we've seen this very, very early on. There are similarities to the way that they engage with toys, but also some things that are different based on the age appropriateness. It's a really good question that we don't know enough about, though, yet. Yeah.
Brian, thank you. That was brilliant.
Oh, thank you.
I'm thinking of the difference between robot and human, and robot and human-controlled robot, in the context of the books and the trash can. Would you say what do you think about that? If the robot were to be human-controlled, or if they had a human telling them, throw it away?
Yeah, so in many of these cases, whether you perceive that the robot is autonomous does in fact make a difference. So if I'm told there's a person who's controlling this system in the other room.
You're not told.
No, go ahead.
If you're not told that there's a human.
Right. So if I am told, then there's a response, and I treat the robot like it's a person, because I know it's a person making the decision. If I'm not told, then I have to make this uncertain judgment. Sometimes people do think that there is a human in control, when in fact it's not. And sometimes in fact people will do the exact opposite. That is, they'll think it's autonomous when in fact there is a human in control. One of the common methods that we use in this field is a prototype study called a Wizard of Oz study, in which the robot is being secretly controlled by a human in the other room, but you're not told that, and we in fact provoke the illusion that there is in fact full autonomy with the robot, even though there is this secret wizard behind the curtain. And we do that as a prototyping device often because the cost of developing that autonomy within the robot is substantial. And if we just want to see what the effect would be, we'll pretend in this way. We ran one study, in fact, where there was a robot on a table and I was standing next to the participant and I had a clipboard. And in fact, I was controlling the robot the entire time because taped to the bottom of the clipboard was a television remote where I could push different buttons on the remote and get the robot to behave. We ran that protocol with over 300 Yale undergraduates. Not one of them ever picked up on the fact that I was running the robot right next to them. When we see these systems and when we're designing them properly, you want to believe. It's not even that we do a good job. I'd like to think we do a good job, but you want to believe that it's autonomous. So in fact, that's almost our default case.
I was wondering in the conformity experiment with Dixit, if you had one group that had a person giving the clue and then the robots following afterwards with a similar but different answer than the other human.
Yeah, so we didn't do that. We did a pilot version of that with the Dixit study. It didn't matter. If it was a human giving the word or a robot giving the word, didn't seem to matter. There are some cases where when we substitute a human in for the robot, it does make a difference. If you remember that study about the effect of embodiment on learning gains with the nonograms, that sort of Sudoku-like puzzle, and I told you if you have the robot sitting next to you, you improve by 6 minutes. Well, one of the things we don't like to report is we actually ran a 5th version of that protocol where instead of getting those clues from a robot sitting next to you, we had a human sitting next to you giving you those clues. Okay, so here's the time when everybody gets to guess. If no clues, you improve by 2 minutes. You get clues, but you get them from the video or just audio, you improve by 4 minutes. With the robot, you improve by 6 minutes. How much do you improve if you have a human there? None? 8 minutes?
It's worse.
4, 6? Okay? The actual answer is -5. People, in fact, get worse the longer we leave them there. Okay? And in fact, this is easy to understand. I'll give you this option. Would you like to take the exam in a room all by yourself, or would you like to take the exam sitting in my office while I stare at you the whole time? I don't know anybody who's going to take the staring exam, right? When we sat a person there, and even though they were giving them these helpful clues, people got nervous. And in fact, their performance basically kept degrading over time. So there are some cases where we don't report the human version, in fact, because it makes such a difference that it does, it's not really comparable. But most of the time we do try a human variant, and when it doesn't make any difference, we just usually don't report it.
Hi. So starting from this last answer you gave in this 5th try, it seems to me that this frontier, right, that shifts very much, not only depending on what's on the other side, but also on the humans on, let's say, on our side. So if you have people that have been growing up in Japan, something looks, if you have Yale undergraduates, they probably behave in a, so what I don't understand is what you call a frontier. It seems to me like a very variable, depending not only on what's on the computer or the machine on the other side, but also on who's, I'm from Italy, and I was thinking, how would Italians react to a computer cheating?
Yeah.
Right? Because we have a different cultural understanding of what is cheating. So, how generalizable are these findings? This is my question.
So, I can give you 2 answers to this. One is, we do know that there are cultural effects and age-related effects especially that impact this boundary. And to some extent, we're okay with that. The idea that I have different cultural boundaries that determine my perceptions, I would expect that. The idea that my perceptions change between when I'm 3 years old and 7 years old and an adult, I'm willing to accept that. That's a standard part of the way we think about the way we perceive the world. And so the fact that this technology has this shifting boundary that's also culturally determined, that I think is something that I think everyone in this field would fully acknowledge. In terms of how repeatable or how universal are these things, that's one of the things that when we find them, when we find those ones that are universal, that hold up across a wide range of circumstances, across a wide range of cultures, across a range of ages, that's when things get to be really interesting. Some of these studies do that and some of them don't. For example, those conformity studies, the really simple one, the ASH studies with matching the line lengths. In fact, if you do that with robots and 5-year-olds, and Tony Belpain has done this in the UK, the 5-year-olds go along with the robots. In fact, about 2/3 of the time, they will change their answer to go along with the robots. Adults won't do it, but kids will. For adults, we have to make it slightly more subtle in order for them to buy into it. Are there cultural differences across that conformity effect? Yeah. In fact, the ASH studies have seen large cultural variations in human-to-human effects of peer influence. So that's where we would expect to see variations in robot influence on them as well. There are other studies, though, that seem to be universal. That compliance result about throwing away things in the trash can, we've had groups, I think I'm up to counting somewhere around 35 groups all over the US, Asia, Europe, South America. I don't think we have any out of Africa yet. But here we see lots of different cultures, all of them showing the same result. That's when we start seeing something and saying, maybe this is something fundamental. And so in fact, mapping these not only in terms of just, where is the boundary, but when does the boundary shift? Does it vary based on age? Does it vary based on culture? That's part of the interesting data to us. I hope that answered your question.
A question about the anthropomorphism aspect of the whole thing. We know, for example, from the way people treat different kinds of animals as pets, there are the fuzzy ones and then there's frogs and so on that we care less about.
Yep.
Are there controls that sort of take, I mean, you said one of your robots had 4 eyes, or 4 cameras. I've already agreed that they're eyes, right?
Right.
But the empathy we have for things that look like us versus other, I mean, you have a control with a robot that looks like a mollusk or something?
Yeah. So there are some things where, many of these things, you have to realize this is a field that's about 10 years old. And the number of things that have been done exhaustively is very small. But there are many places where we do see a range of different kinds of robots being used. And I didn't have this slide up here, but for example, when we do work with children with ASD, with autism, one of the things we wonder about is what's the range of robots where we see these effects? And so we see some robots develop that look more like people, or more like dolls, or more like pets, or more like, mechanical, what robots are supposed to look like, right? And we see this variety, and then we start thinking maybe it's not something about the appearance. And then what's really compelling is when we see somebody do it with something that's really abstract. There's a group in Canada that does these studies with kids with ASD with a robot that is literally just a sphere. There's no markings on the outside of it. It's literally a ball. And yet it rolls around on the floor, and it changes direction, and it responds to the child, and they get the same kind of learning effects. And that's the point at which we say, maybe it's really hard to think that it has something to do with appearance when you can do it with these geometric shapes that have nothing anthropomorphic about them. So these aren't proof in the way that we would like to be able to say definitively appearance doesn't matter or appearance does matter. But what we have at this point is a sampling in that space. Yes, yeah, and exactly. And so one of the questions is, what are the minimal sets of behavior that you need in order to generate these responses. And we're roboticists, and so everything we do costs us in terms of time and energy. And so we are naturally minimalists. We want to get the minimal set of things to provoke a response. And that's why we deal usually with things that are very simplified in form.
So I'm going to take the privilege of asking you the last question before we wrap up. And I just want to point out we have a nice reception outside where we can continue the conversation. So Brian, I was very curious with these experiments, whether there was a notion of added expertise, authority that is conferred on these robots as opposed to sort of human control robots versus just humans.
Yeah.
Is that an effect that you guys look at? I mean, can robots get humans to follow orders better than humans can get other humans to?
Yeah, so it's hard to do a comparison with robots as, sort of giving instructions versus humans as giving instructions, because they are different. And if I had someone who was, who could take on a social status that was as uncertain as the robots, then maybe that would be possible for me to measure. But there are a lot of studies that we've been able to do where we, number one, show that people will follow those robots when they give instructions, and in fact that we can use those robots to very subtly manipulate people. And in fact, it's sometimes more the very minute things that matter, much more than the overt framing. And let me give you a very quick example, a last story. We ran a protocol where we brought two people into the lab, and we told them that they were going to take turns playing a game with a robot, Connect 4, okay, a little like tic-tac-toe-like game. And secretly, one of those two people was a Confederate and was working for me. And I said, okay, to the Confederate, you're going to play first. While you're playing, the other person is going to keep score. And so the Confederate would start playing the game, and about halfway through the game, I called their cell phone, and they said, oh, I'm sorry, this is my dean, I've got to answer this, I'll be right back, and they left the room. And while they were gone, the robot picked up an extra piece and put it in, and picked up an extra piece and put it in, and picked up an extra piece and put it in. Cheated, effectively. The Confederate walks back into the room, and the question is, does the scorekeeper report that the robot had done this? So first, do they spontaneously do it? Almost none of them spontaneously report it. The Confederate then asks, did something weird happen? It looks like something's different at the board. And keeps asking them question after question until finally it asks them, did the robot cheat? Did the robot put in more pieces? And about 50% of our undergraduates at that point will say, no. They'll lie right through their teeth. Okay? Now here's the subtle part. If we bring in another group, the Confederate's phone rings, they leave the room, the robot picks up a piece, looks at it, and then it looks at you, puts it in, picks up another piece, and it looks at you, and it puts it in. And now the Confederate comes back in, and now about 75% of our undergraduates lie. And as a last and final one, third group comes in, the Confederate, we call their phone, they leave the room, the robot picks up a piece, and it looks at you, and it goes, and it drops it in, and it does the same thing. And we have never had an undergraduate tell the truth in that situation. Every single one of the, 100 or so we've tested has lied at that point. And it's not just that they lie, they have to lie multiple times because the Confederate comes back in and says, did something weird happen? No. Did the board change? No. Did the robot do something? No. Over and over again. Sometimes we don't need the big framing, sometimes it's those little bits of social influence that actually make much more of a difference. And so that's why we don't often do these sort of high-level comparisons, right, because it's really in the details that it matters. Oh yeah, and some of them will actually go as far as they won't tell us afterwards They will continue to lie to us afterwards, even though after we explain it to them, we say, we know the robot did this. They'll say, no. Some of them are just so entrenched in the idea of, I'm not going to tell.
Thank you so much, Brian, for a scintillating talk. Thank you.
Thank you.